morning, everybody. I'm going to talk briefly about my trip to Rome, Assisi, and Milan. Should take maybe a little under an hour. I went in spring of 2022, which was just this spring. Quick introduction about myself. My name is Dwayne Deslatte. I was a member of this church growing up. I was raised here in Texas City. My dad, Jim Delatte's been a member for 54 years. He's currently the treasurer. So Mrs. Marianne Reed, who taught me citizenship in the nation and citizenship in community merit badge as a scout, had the idea that we would, maybe I could give a presentation this morning about my trip, because she'd seen some of the things that I put on Facebook. I'm a registered nurse by trade. I work as a travel nurse these days. I travel around the country helping folks out, and currently I'm going to be stationed back in Indiana in about 3 weeks, but right now I'm enjoying being home in Texas. I also have a Bachelor of Arts in History, and so I guess that kind of contributes to my interest in history, especially history of art, history of ancient Rome, and the history of the church. So, why Rome? Why is Rome so important to Christianity? Who are these guys? Anybody know? Anybody want to hazard a guess who the guy on the left is?
God, Peter.
No, that's right, St. Peter. That's right, Arlen, you're absolutely right. So St. Peter on the left. We know it's St. Peter for a couple of reasons. One, he's holding the keys, and if you remember in the gospel, Jesus says, whatever is bound in heaven, we give you basically the keys to the kingdom. And so the Bishop of Rome traditionally has the keys, is kind of, in the Catholic tradition, is holds the keys. And the guy on the right, anybody?
John the Baptist?
No, good guess. If we have St. Peter, we probably have
St. Paul.
That's right, St. Paul. So these are mosaics. This one is from St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and the one on the right is from the Kora Church in Istanbul. But they are, obviously central to the development of Christianity. Without St. Paul and the mission to the Gentiles, without St. Peter also missioning to the Gentiles, but also involved with the early birth of the church in Jerusalem, and then both of them wound up in Rome and were both martyred in October of 64 AD in Rome. That's what tradition tells us. So because of that, in the early Christian church, it was very important. The early Christians would very, very often hold and keep together the bones, the remains of the early saints, and they would either build churches on that spot or they would memorialize those spots. And so in this case, in Rome, we know near St. Peter's Basilica, legend tells us, and some history and some archaeology tells us that right on that spot where St. Peter's is where we have the bones of St. Peter. St. Paul is a little more confusing as to exactly where he may or may not be buried, but it's in Rome. Okay, St. Peter's Basilica. I am not going to talk about St. Peter's Basilica. I'm not going to talk about the Vatican City State, only because it's a whole other presentation, which I'd be happy to do for you guys, but it's way too much to do or cover, and to cover the other things I saw. Also, I didn't actually go to the Vatican on this trip. I was in Rome for 12 days. I've been there a couple times. I love it, but it was Easter week, and I didn't feel like getting in the crowd, to be honest with you. So, St. Peter's is, of course, the largest church in the world. It was designed by Bramante, Moderno, Michelangelo, and Bernini. All had a piece in it. It was started in 1506. It was completed in 1626. It is, if you've ever been, one of the most magnificent buildings in the world. I catch my breath every time I walk in it. It's just unbelievable. Inside St. Peter's is what you see on the left here, the Baldacchino, which was designed by John Bernini. You're going to hear that guy's name over and over, and I swear I did not go to make a Bernini tour of Rome. But when I did this slideshow, I realized over and over and over again how important Bernini was to the Renaissance, more Baroque era of Rome's art and architecture development. The Baldacchino that he built, this big bronze structure, sits over the actual tomb of St. Peter, which is under here. There are stairways going down. There was a small ossuary or stone box found back in the last century, in the 20th century, that is believed to be and dated to be from the time St. Peter would have been alive. So we have to take a few things with a grain of salt and a grain of faith, but it is believed that this is the spot where Peter was executed, which was in an old Roman circus, which we'll talk about circuses more in a minute. The Sistine Chapel, of course, the beautiful Last Judgment that you see in the blue area by Michelangelo, and of course Michelangelo's incredible creation of man. You can see God touching Adam there with the finger up at the top. If you haven't been, here again, incredible, beautiful. We can talk about it all day long. The amount of art in this room alone is staggering, absolutely staggering, because it's not just Michelangelo. It's a whole panoply of different artists. So I got to Rome, and first thing I did, I got really lucky because I got a hotel room that right around the corner from it was St. Mary Major. It is one of what's called the 7 pilgrim churches of Rome. The pilgrim churches were named by St. Philip Neri in the 1600s during the Counter-Reformation. And the reason that was done is he wanted to emphasize important places of the early apostles. And St. Mary Major was founded in 432 AD. It is considered to be one of the best examples of a basilica structure, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Behind it, and my hotel was like here, so it was great. Behind it is one of the Roman obelisks, and the reason it's a Roman obelisk is this was an obelisk that the Romans, and when I say the Romans in this, I'm going to mean the guys with the swords and the hats that were in the Roman Empire and later the first Roman Republic and Roman Empire. So about 2,000 years ago, the Romans had this commission, this obelisk commission, to be made in Europe, in Egypt, and then it was brought here, and it was initially placed in front of the tomb of Augustus Caesar, or Octavian, as you may have known from school, who was Julius Caesar's heir. So the Romans like to bury their dead in mausoleums. We'll see an example of that a little later. So this was found, this obelisk was arrived in Rome in 1527. It was found, buried, and they re-erected it here on the right behind St. Mary Major. What's a basilica? Does anybody got a good example of what a basilica is? Anybody? All right.
Is it referring to the shape of a building?
That's good, Becca. That's absolutely right. So it has to do with the kind of building that it's a certain type of building. Initially, a basilica was a Roman municipal structure. The Romans built these basilicas in order to have a place where the magistrate would sit, which would be in the apse, which is this rounded back part of this church. But the magistrate would sit in that apse area and deliver judgments. In addition, in a Roman basilica, there would be courts, there would be other official public buildings. And so it was a Roman term that they used in antiquity. This is considered to be one of the best examples of a Roman basilica, although it wasn't built as a Roman basilica. It was built as a church after Constantine had made Christianity legal, street legal, kind of, so to speak, in the Roman Empire. The reason that it's so distinctive as a basilica is, if you'll notice, it has a raised middle area in the nave to allow windows, clerestory windows, to bring light in, right? Because there was no light fixture, there was no electricity, and then 2 side aisles. This is absolutely prototypical of what you'll see as a basilica. Now, we use the word basilica differently today. In the Roman Catholic Church, any church can be a basilica if the Pope gives it that honor. In Galveston, there is the St. Mary's Basilica. It is an honor to be called a basilica. There are only 4 major basilicas, and they are all in Rome. So this St. Mary Major is one of those. As soon as I walked in, boom, here were 20 priests, a bishop and a cardinal, and they were off to go celebrate Mass. It was a Saturday afternoon, and in front of what's called the Salus Populi Romanum, which translates to the health and salvation of the Roman people. It is a very old, icon. It dates back to at least 590. Legend has it that St. Luke, who wrote St. Luke in Acts, was talking to Mary and painted a picture of her while she was telling stories of Jesus' life. That's, of course, a legend, probably, but art historians date it to around 590. It is considered extremely important to the Romans. During plagues and times of calamity, they would take this icon, because it's like an icon, and they would take it through the streets. Pope Francis, before he leaves on any trip, started the tradition of going and saying prayers here in this Borghese Chapel in St. Mary before he leaves on a trip. Underneath another baldacchino, one of these four-legged, huge bronze covers, is another chapel underneath the altar, and this holds what is purported to be the relics of the manger of Jesus. Inside there are inside this urn here are 5 cedar planks that were supposed to be from the actual manger of Jesus. And in addition, under there is the burial site of St. Jerome, who's both a Catholic and an Anglican saint. Every saint that I mention here in big slides are all Catholic and Anglican saints. And of course, Episcopal. St. Jerome was the translator of the Bible. He translated the Bible into Latin way back in the 300s-400s. So he is buried here. The guy on the right, the statue you see, is Pius IX, who was a pope in the 1800s and was particularly devoted to St. Jerome. If you ever heard of Ignatius of Loyola, he said his first mass here actually too, on that altar right there. And he founded the Jesuit order, which I know Jose went to Jesuit school. Recycled columns of granite and Athenian marble. This is interesting. You'll find this throughout the ancient world. While the church is from 324, those columns are older. Because what happened was, the Romans had temples everywhere. We'll see a few examples of them. But most of them were destroyed in Rome. After pagan worship was out of vogue and the worship of Christian churches was established, they reused all of these columns. So these columns came from either the church that sat on this spot before, or more likely from a despoiled Roman temple. So you'll see this, a lot of times you'll see in a church that this column won't match this column. They'll be completely different because they were just taken as they could. And of course, as time went along and we descend into the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, they don't know how to make these. We don't get this kind of know-how again until the Renaissance, the rebirth of knowledge that occurs in the 1500s. This ceiling is gilded with gold. Most interestingly, the gold that it was gilded from came from Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the Catholic kings and queens of Spain, and who had sent Columbus to the New World. Columbus came back from the New World. He came back with gold. Ferdinand and Isabella donated some of that gold to gild the ceiling, which is absolutely gorgeous. I will say that these pictures do not give a sense of size, and it's somewhat due to my camera, but this is huge. It's absolutely large. I mean, this is a big place. If you've been there, you know, but it is a big place. We're going to talk about Bernini a bit. John Bernini lived a long life, 82 years, which was an exceedingly long time to live in the 1600s. He is buried in St. Mary Major. That's his burial site. He was a devout Catholic. He was a sculptor, an artist, and an architect. We're going to see a lot of his work in this presentation. So I got to Rome, and this was my home in Rome for 12 nights. And it's San Gregorio al Celio, which is the monastery of Pope St. Gregory the Great. It's bigger than it looks, and those stairs are higher than they look. Let me tell you something. So Dwayne, I booked this through a thing called Monastery Stays, which was just a website I found, and basically they handled all the paperwork and talking in Italian and all that kind of thing. And they booked the site. It was 50 euros a night, which is a song. It's located right across from the Circus Maximus, which we'll see in a minute, and it's right down the street from the Coliseum. That easy walking distance. It's a beautiful spot. This front facade was built in the 1600s and leads into a courtyard and a church. And I stayed in some of the dormitories on the very top floor, and there were no elevators. So I got my exercise. Let's talk about Pope St. Gregory the Great real quick. He was the Bishop of Rome from 509 to 604. He was known for instituting the first large-scale actual mission from the Catholic Church to England. It was called the Gregorian Mission, after him. He sent a St. Augustine, not the St. Augustine who wrote the Confessions, a different St. Augustine, to convert the largely pagan Anglo-Saxons. He had seen some captured Anglo-Saxons in a cage, as that's how the slaves were brought to Rome, and he says, oh, they're not Angles, they're angels. And so he was prompted to send this mission to England. He was a Roman senator's son and been a prefect, or the equivalent of like a mayor of Rome. He then became a monk. He established a monastery on that very hill, which is called the Caelian Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome. So the monastery is up on a hill, and it kind of extends behind it, hence my having to walk up. He lived in that monastery, which was on his family estate, until he was elected Pope of Rome. He didn't want to be Pope, wasn't interested, but he did the job because he was elected. He stayed and ran the church mostly from this area. That monastery still stands today. It's been rebuilt, added to. The Camel Daisy monks have had possession of this monastery since about 500 years, and they're still there. There are 6 monks there. I got to know them a little bit. And there are 14 sisters that live in a separate area that are Benedictine Camel Daisy monks that live on the property and minister to them. And they have a regular congregation that comes. I was able to go to the Holy Week services there. It was pretty tremendous. St. Gregory the Great, like I said about St. Jerome, also a saint considered in Episcopal Church, Catholic Church, Orthodox Church. Have you ever heard of Gregorian chant? You know, with the monks and that comes from St. Gregory the Great, Gregorian chant. Gregory. These are those crazy steps up. I love this picture because the sun was right behind it. This is my view outside my window. It was a great accommodation. Had my own shower. It's about that big. Somehow I fit in it. If you were really fat, you could not get in that shower. It was really small. My view is of the Palatine Hill, where you can see those trees. The Palatine Hill was where the Roman emperors kept their huge palaces. It is a ridiculously beautiful view. This was my view from across the street. This is a little bit of the architecture leading up to the Palatine Hill. I got to Rome on a perfect week. I'd been in London the week before. It's freezing cold. This week was great. It was in the 70s, 60s, 70s. Perfect. And it's just beautiful there. This is the actual chair of St. Gregory the Great, which is in the monastery of Alcelio. It is, you can see that it's got many different, it's got kind of an angel here. It's very ancient, and it is reported to be, and undoubtedly is, the actual chair St. Gregory the Great would sit in to give his orders and marching orders even off to England for the missionaries. The next place I went was the Church of St. Praxedes. This was actually, I think, on my first day, full day. So the Church of St. Praxedes is interesting because it holds what's called the Column of the Flagellation, which is, my picture's on the right. I pulled this one from Wikipedia in the center because it was just to give a little bit better view. St. Helena, who was Constantine's mother, was a committed Christian, and when Constantine became emperor in the early 300s, she sent a mission and went to Jerusalem, to the holy sites, to find as many things as she could bring back to Rome. And this is purported to be the column which Christ was bound to and then scourged. We know this from the Bible that this happened. So this is purported to be that column. It's important in art too, because in a lot of art, especially in the Renaissance and after that, they would use this as kind of the pole. They could see this in Rome. They're like, that's what that looks like. So we're gonna paint it that way. This amazing mosaic is very old. It comes, I believe, from the 600s, and it is. It's been call it. It's been fixed up, but it looks great. What is a mosaic? Can anybody tell me?
Little pieces of colored marble.
That's right, Hank. Absolutely. It's little pieces of marble or glass that's painted and put together such that it makes a picture. If you go to St. Peter's in Rome, then everything you see that you think's a painting is not. They're all mosaics. They're all mosaics, and mosaics are great because they last a long, long time. They don't fade away like a painting might. This is interesting. This is the church of St. Pudentiana. Oh, let me go back real quick. St. Praxedes and St. Pudentiana were both daughters of Pudens. Pudens was one of the St. Peter's earliest actual converts in Rome. In 2 Timothy, there's a 4:21. There is Paul has a list of people who send greetings from Rome to Timothy, and one of them was Pudens. Well, he had 4 children, all of which were martyred. And so this is the church of St. Pudentiana, who was, we don't know a lot about her, but the story was that she was martyred while trying to give a Christian burial, which was illegal, during the early Christian church. This is the oldest church in Rome. If this thing was in the United States, they would have a glass ceiling, they would have it enclosed in a glass bubble. In Rome, it's not very well kept up, and there were about 3 people. In the United States, if we had this thing that's, from like the 150s AD, I think we would have it in an amazing building. Not at all here. This facade was built during the Baroque era. Inside it, it's very simple, and it's, like I said, it's very ancient. You can see the archways there, very old. The big and most important part of this church is actually the mosaic. The mosaic was in the apse. Remember, that's that back part of the church there. Is from the late 300s, and it is one of the oldest Christian mosaics. The interesting thing about it is it's one of the first mosaics or pictures that actually shows Jesus as a man. Jesus had often been shown to be a kind of a symbol, and the symbol would either be as a shepherd holding a staff or as a Lamb of God. It would literally be the lamb. But here we see Jesus as a man, and we not only see him as a man, we see him decked out. What's he wearing there? What's that? It's a toga. He's wearing a Roman senatorial toga. It's gold, which was an expensive thing to own, and if you'll see there, wrapped around it is it's emblazoned with purple, the sign of royalty. The apostles are also wearing Roman togas. If you think about it, our clerical dress, the dress that priests and in the Episcopal Church that the lay readers wear, this all comes from the Roman era. Because remember, once Christianity became legal, it took over many parts of the Roman culture. So the way priests dress, this all comes from the Roman times. St. Pudentiana herself is the lady in yellow leaning over. I wish I had a better picture of it, but sometimes it's hard to get a really good picture, especially when it's dark. The next day I decided to take a walk. It ended up being a very long walk. I started my walk right outside the Caelian Hill and went through the Aurelian walls. These are the walls that extend out. There was an initial wall called the Severian walls that covered just the innermost part of Rome. The Aurelian walls were built in 271 to 275 AD, and they cover all 7 hills of the Rome: the Capitoline Hill, the Esquiline Hill, the Caelian Hill, Palatine Hill. All the hills of Rome were enclosed. These walls are absolutely massive. You can see just how big they are. You can see the slits in here for the archers to defend the city. I was bowled over by that. They were initially like 30 feet tall and then expanded up to 60 feet later on during the Empire. I walked through the Porto San Sebastian, which is the largest preserved gate in Rome, and it's built right into the walls extending out on either side. There's a museum there. It was closed that day, but it was built in 275. Amazing structure. Absolutely beautiful. So let's go for a hike outside Rome, because everything inside those walls in the ancient days was considered Rome. Everything outside was considered outside the walls. But first, let's get some water. So this fountain right here is one of a fountain from antiquity. I could not find any specific information about it, but it's absolutely from antiquity. And when I say antiquity, I mean back in the Roman times. It had, in antiquity, there were 39 monumental fountains, very large fountains built, and 591 public basins, because you can't have a city like Rome with 1 million people in it around the time of Jesus without having water. Romans were amazing in building aqueducts, bring water in from the city. They used gravity and a system of filters that are, Roman aqueducts still stand all around the world. You can find them in Spain, you can find them in Italy. They were master builders. These still work. Now they work from some different pipes, but in Rome, you'll find fountains everywhere. And you can just go up and just take a drink. And I took a drink right out of this fountain, and the water is great. Water's the best water, some of the best water in the world is from Rome because it comes from the Apennine Mountains. So then I descended on a trip on the Appian Way. Now the Appian Way was constructed in 321 BC as a route to move military supplies from Rome down to Apulia, which, if you think about Italy as a boot, you've often heard of it as a boot, and the heel of the boot is where Apulia is. It's very far away. The Romans were master builders of roads. This part's paved, but on many parts of it, it was cobblestone are still there, extant from ancient days. The Romans knew how to build roads, and of course you've heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. It's definitely appropriate here. It was another beautiful day outside. First place I got to was Santa Maria in Palmas, also known as the Quo Vadis Church. This story comes from the Acts of Peter, which is a apocryphal book written in early Christian times. And in that story, Peter is leaving Rome because the persecutions of the Emperor Nero were occurring, and he was getting out of town. He was just going to leave and spread the gospel elsewhere. As he's leaving, at this spot, he encounters Jesus. And Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, where are you going?" And that translates into Latin, Quo Vadis, where do you go? So the Lord looks at him and says, "I'm going back to Rome to be crucified again." And that's when Peter knew that that's what he needed to do. He needed to go back and face the persecution here. And the history tells us that when Peter was crucified, or legend tells us that he was crucified upside down. In the gospel it talks about, there's a space in there that talks about where he's like, "Lord, I want to follow you." Well, you will follow me, but you will not go in the way you want to. And so that is the tradition. This right here marked the spot, and there are 2 indentations of feet where this supposedly occurred. There has been a church there for a very long time, church since the 9th century. There was a very famous book written in the 1800s by a Polish author who wrote this book, Quo Vadis. I think it became a movie too, back in the 50s, maybe 50s. This was the chapel in which he got the idea to do this. That is not the actual impression of the feet. We'll see that in a little bit. So I continued on down the way. While you're walking, you'll see these amazing old Roman structures from old mausoleums, country houses, circuses, and they're just in ruin, but it's amazing to walk by and just see these structures. I next got to the Basilica of San Sebastian beyond the walls. What an amazing church. And it sits over some catacombs. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, they were closed. That's okay. I went into the church. It is a very ancient church. It is another one of the 7 pilgrim churches of Rome. It ranks very high as far as the important churches in Rome because in 258, during the persecutions of the Emperor Valerian, the known relics of Peter and Paul were brought here and put in the catacombs. It was actually where the home of the Pope. The Pope this was his center of activity until the Lateran Palace was taken over when Constantine gave the Lateran Palace, which we'll see in a little bit, to the Bishop of Rome. Has an amazing ceiling. This picture doesn't capture how beautiful it is. That blue up there with the crest of one of the cardinals. Just beautiful. On the right is what's purported to be Bernini's last sculpture. It was kind of rediscovered in a sacristy here in this church and brought for display. Art historians are a little fuzzy about if he participated in building it or in constructing it or really sculpted it himself. But it's very beautiful. It's called Salvator Mundus, Salvation of the World. This, on the other hand, is amazing. Well, not that this other sculpture was. This sculpture is a sculpture of Saint Sebastian, who the church is named for, by Giuseppe Giorgetti. And this was my picture. I don't know if you can see the arrows that are going in here. The legend is that Saint Sebastian was martyred in 288 during the persecutions of Diocletian. He was tied to a post, he was shot full of arrows, and left for dead. Another Saint Irene of Rome came to try to give him Christian burial, found him, he wasn't dead, nursed him back to health. He got well. He then proceeded to march straight up to Diocletian and tell the emperor all the wrongdoings he was done, and warn him of his sins, and he was summarily clubbed to death. After that, this is where his, in the catacombs below is where he's buried. I went to the old internet though, and I got a much better picture of this statue. This is just a tremendous, this is Giorgetti's masterpiece, and it is just absolutely tremendous statue. I marvel at the ability of these sculptors. It is just tremendous. So the actual feet that we talked about, the impressions of where Peter met Jesus, the legend is that he left the impressions of his feet in rock, and those are the actual feet. In the urn above are supposedly some of the arrows that pierced Saint Sebastian. Get a little drink here real quick. Continued on my walk, and I got to the Circus of Maxentius. This was built by Emperor Maxentius around 310 AD. A circus is a oval-shaped stadium in which games were played. This circus, we're going to see a much bigger one in a minute, was still pretty large. It was only used once. They built this huge, massive stadium. It was 1,000 Roman feet long in the middle, or the spine of it. These two gates that you see are really one of the only big pieces left. And they held a gate. They would pull that gate up from there, and that's where the chariots would take off and begin the race. So circuses could be used for foot races, it could be used for gladiator games, it could be used for chariot races, all of it, even theater productions. This one was much more of a ceremonial thing. And that's pretty much what we have left of it right there. The last place I got was 4 miles out on the Appian Way. I could have kept going forever, but I knew I had to walk back. So this is the tomb of Cecilia Metella. It's built in approximately 20 BC. How do we know it's the tomb of Cecilia Metella? Well, the reason we know that is this is the actual mausoleum. It's a typical Roman mausoleum. It's rounded in shape. It's 24 feet thick. You can actually walk inside it. I got a picture, but it was a very good picture. And inside it, there was an area where the urn with her ashes or bones would have been placed. The reason we know exactly who is buried in here is because here's her name, still in place after 2,040 years, right there in travertine marble. The facing stones are still pretty complete in this upper area of marble. They've, of course, been taken and used in other places. This structure is from the 1300s. It was built by a Roman family, the Catani family, in 1303, and that's still pretty old. 800 years ago, you can kind of see the Romanesque window there. But it's in ruin now. The Catani family controlled the Appian Way in the Middle Ages, and they would collect what the text said, exorbitant tolls to passersby. It was really tremendous, and you could go inside. It was all in ruin, but it was pretty neat to see. I decided then to start my way back. It was a long day, 8 miles, but I was glad and fortunate to be able to make this trip outside of Rome and back in. On the way back to the monastery, little comic relief, I saw this guy. He was parked there all 12 days, not sure what's going on. We got the Vatican flag, the Italian flag, and there he was. All right, so right outside of my hotel, or right outside the monastery, was the Circus Maximus. So we just talked about the Maxentian Circus. This was the primary circus of Rome. This stadium, and you had to kind of use your imagination, but if you can see here, here's a level of where seats would be. Here's a level of where seats would be on either side. And this is the actual racetrack coming around, okay? This stadium held 150,000 people. Now, even the Rose Bowl only holds like 100,000 people. Michigan Stadium, I think, maybe 110. We don't have a stadium this big. It's amazing that this thing exists, and only really by being there do you really get a sense of how big it is. It measures 2,000 feet in length, 387 feet wide, and it was established in the 6th century BC, so it goes back 2,500 years. It was the largest venue for Roman ludi, or games. So these games could be one-day affairs or multi-day affairs. They could have hunts. They would literally release wild animals, and they would watch them be shot with arrows, or gladiators would fight them. Gladiators would fight each other. Foot races. But most importantly, if you think back to a movie like Spartacus in your head, for those of us who are old enough to remember that movie, that's the kind of racing that would have gone on here. This was the penultimate place in the empire for chariot racing. After Christianity took hold, games fell out of favor. The last known races that were held here were in 549 AD. That's another good picture. I just walked kind of down into it to get an example of the circus. And there's old Dwayne. All right. We're going to see several fountains. This is a fountain of Triton by Bernini. This was commissioned by the Barberini family, and one of the Barberinis, Pope Clement, had become Pope. We know that it's the Pope's fountain there because you can see the keys again, the keys of the kingdom. You can see those right there. And if you look on the right, you see bees. See those 3 bees? Those bees represent the Barberini family crest. So families were everything to the Italians back then. It wasn't so much that you had allegiance to an area, you had allegiance to your family. And you know, this isn't during the Renaissance, Baroque era, lots of back dealings and shady dealings sometimes. But this fountain was sponsored by the Pope and still exists today. It was actually the first fountain that Bernini actually constructed, and it provided water for the people from a newly restored aqueduct, the first new aqueduct that came into Rome. Speaking of Barberini, this was their little home that they had. It was the Palazzo Barberini. It was built in the 17th century, and it now holds the antique art gallery of the Italian state. Beautiful, beautiful place. Borromini, who was another architect, kind of Bernini's competitor, built this amazing helical staircase, which was only used actually by the family to go up to their private quarters. Just remarkable. 1633 when this was built. It's got like an oval window at the top to let light in. Just tremendous. There's a huge salon here. You can see that room on the right. It's probably about the size of this room, maybe just a little longer. This ceiling by Cortona, in no way does this show you the absolute beauty of this room. I wish I could just bring it and pop it up on the ceiling. The name of this painting is The Allegory of Divine Providence and Barberini Power. Speaking of St. Gregory the Great that we talked about earlier, in this art gallery is an actual picture of St. Gregory. In pictures in the Renaissance and the Baroque era, you're going to see often 2 different subjects. One is going to be church subjects, the other subject is going to be mythological subjects. Usually in the church subjects, there's going to be kind of standard tropes, standard things you're going to see associated with each saint. St. Gregory, of course, we see to the left, papal tiara, the crown that the Pope would wear, representing that he was a Pope. On the right, the Holy Spirit, You see the dove there giving him wisdom. Two more sculptures of Pope Clement, who was that Barberini Pope by Bernini. Just amazing sculptures, so lifelike. Just blows you away. Very famous picture by Caravaggio. Caravaggio was a very famous Italian painter. Caravaggio was actually not his name. That's where he was from, the city of Caravaggio, or the little town. His real name was Michelangelo Mercy, not to be confused with Michelangelo you're thinking about. This is a picture from the Bible, Judith beheading Holofernes. It's just tremendous. Caravaggio was famous because if you'll notice, everything is dark, and he illuminates the people with light. And that's one of the things, it's a chiaroscuro painting. Chiaroscuro. All right, for the ladies, they had these. I thought these were amazing from the 16th century. These are some high heels, eh? I mean, those are some real high heels. Absolutely. They call it chapinis. I cannot imagine wearing these. I can't imagine wearing regular things. This is an amazing sculpture by Corradini, considered to be one of his masterpieces. You can see it's of a Vestal Virgin they kept the temple flame in Roman times. But it's this type of wet veil, and he was able to sculpt this. This is the back and this is the front. Just tremendous. I thought everybody might like to see one of the chandeliers in one of the palace's rooms there. Just beautiful. I couldn't get a date on that, but I thought they were amazing. Baroque. Does anybody know what the word Baroque means? Characterized by ornate detail, usually in the 16th, 17th century, exuberant detail, movement, grandeur, and surprise to achieve a sense of awe. And a sense of awe is what I got on this corner in Rome. This has got to be the most Baroque corner in Rome. So what you have here, I don't know who designed this fountain, but as you can see, it's tremendous. Just over the top. Still operating. This church was by Borromini, and then the church on the right, Church of St. Andrea al Quirinal, was by Bernini. It was said by Bernini's son that he would come and sit in this church in order to just, as in his old age, to just sit in this church to be amazed and marvel at this thing he built. And there is no doubt, this is the most Baroque, over-the-top building I've ever walked into. It's small, it's in the round. It was the novitiate for the Jesuits, the novitiate chapel for the original Jesuit order. There's one of the Jesuit saints is buried there. You can see this. So there's a painting here. These are statues that are all molded around it. It's just absolutely beautiful. Just blown away. I was continuing my walk that day, and I came upon a fountain by Fontana. It was built in 1586. This was built to commemorate the Pope that had this built, had the first new aqueduct built into Rome that brought water. The old aqueducts were there, but they didn't work by this point in the Renaissance. So this was the first, I don't know if y'all know this, but Rome went through a huge period of decline. So here it is. It's the absolute center of the world, and this is when Jesus was born. Things declined in the 500s. By the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, it was a small town. It went from having 1 million people to having maybe 30,000 people in it. So this was part of the reinvigoration of Rome, bringing fresh water back into town. And this was where the aqueduct ended. People could go get their water. It made a big difference. Okay, some things you might have seen before. The Arch of Constantine. This is the largest Roman arch. It was built to celebrate Constantine's victory in the Dacian Wars. Dacia was basically modern-day Romania. So when the emperors would defeat, a hostile enemy, they would win, and they would parade them as slaves and with all the booty and treasure, and they would come down this triumphal way right through this area, and that's where this triumphal arch was built to celebrate his victory. It is the largest of the triumphal arches that you see in Rome. To the right, Colosseum. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the Colosseum. There's again the good picture of the Arch of Constantine, 312 AD. It's emblazoned with all the different parts of the battle that occurred. The the Colosseum. This is a picture I took from 2 years ago. I've been in a couple times. I didn't go in it directly on this trip, but I thought it was good to include it. It's known as the Flavian Amphitheater because the Flavians were the family of emperors that built it. It was erected from 70 to 80 AD by Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. The inauguration of it included some 9,000 wild animals being killed during the inaugural games. It's famous, of course, for being a site of gladiator battles. The reason it's called an amphitheater, though, that's kind of interesting, right? Amphitheater. If you think of the word amphibious, you think of the word on water, because they would fill this up at times and have naval battles, actual naval battles with ships to reconstruct famous naval battles in history would be constructed inside the amphitheater. This area below is called the hypogeum. This is where there are huge lifts that can be used by counterweights to bring up elephants or lions or tigers or the gladiators themselves to bring them up to the stadium floor. It was interesting too. There used to be a sail, a solarium, a sail that would be over. It was big, huge pieces of fabric that they would have naval soldiers actually would work that covered the Colosseum all around. It's just a little circle left in the middle, and they had the Roman naval sailors would actually, because it was like a sail, they could control it with levees and pulleys. This is the Market of Trajan. This is one of the first malls in the world. All of those little areas in here, you see these small little recesses. These were shops in the empire. That's around 110 AD. Tremendous place. I'd never been before. The lower area there where you see a couple of columns was the forum area, kind of a public area. This is Trajan's Column. It's bigger than it looks. It's tall. It commemorates Trajan's victory in the Dacian Wars, roughly modern-day Romania. That column has 2,662 figures and 155 scenes that all wrap around like this. Just absolutely tremendous thing to see. The next day I went and visited St. John the Lateran Church, which is actually the Cathedral of Rome. St. Peter's is not the cathedral. Does anybody know why a cathedral is called a cathedral?
Something to do
With what, Alan?
Something to do with the Pope.
Well, we have cathedrals in the Episcopal Church too. So the reason is the word. Yep, it has to do with the bishop. That's exactly right. The reason it has to do with the bishop, it's from the word cathedra or chair. So wherever the bishop's chair is where the cathedral is. So in Rome, the bishop's chair is actually at St. John the Lateran. It's not at St. Peter's. And the Episcopal Church, Dad and I just passed it the other day. It's the chair for this diocese is in Houston, right there at the cathedral. For the Episcopal Church. So wherever the chair is, that's where you're going to find a cathedral. In the plaza in the back of the Lateran is the Lateran obelisk. This obelisk is the largest standing Egyptian obelisk in the world. It's 105 feet tall, weighs 300 tons. It's red granite, and it was completed by Tutmosis IV, the Egyptian pharaoh, in the 15th century BC. So it's 3,500 years old. There's another great picture of it with the hieroglyphs right there on the shaft of the obelisk. This is the front of St. John the Lateran Archbasilica. It was initially created in 324. It's been reworked extensively over the decades. It was gutted by fire. It's huge. It's not St. Peter's size, but it is very, very big. This is inside of it. To get a sense of the size, there's a nun right here praying. Okay, so you can see these massive statues that line the nave of the Archbasilica. These statues were they were commissioned by the church, and there's 12 sculptures of the apostles, except for Judas. They didn't include Judas. They added in St. Paul. And the statues were some of the most eminent sculptors of the 18th century sculpted these statues. This is looking back into the apse and over the altar there. There's a good example. You can see a person down there on the right and then the huge, massive sculptures. That day I continued on, and I found this little church, the Basilica of St. Stefano Rotondo, a very old church from the 470s. Oldest example of a centrally planned church in Rome, and it's in the round. Very remarkable. All around the church ring are examples, 34 different scenes of martyrdom. And I don't know if you can see, this gentleman's being crucified. There's this guy's being hung in the rack. They go all around the church. Some are in much better shape than others. We talked about Roman temples earlier. I said that most of them are gone. Here's a couple of examples that are still in place. On the left, the Temple of Hercules Victor, and on the right, the Temple of Plotinus. This is in an area called the Forum Boarium, and this was the cattle market area, actually, right by the river. These are in tremendous shape. There's another very good example of the Temple of Hercules Victor that you can see right there. Not only did they reuse the columns at times to build churches, sometimes they just built the churches over the old Roman temple. You can see a good example of that here in St. Nicola in Carceri, which is just right down the street from those temples we just looked at. This is the theater of Marcellus. Julius Caesar himself had the land cleared out to build this structure. This was the largest theater in Rome. It seated anywhere from 11,000 to 20,000 spectators. This is just part of the eastern wall of it. To the right, you see a temple, some columns from the temple to Apollo. The Pons Fabricus. This is the oldest bridge in Rome. It's built in 62 BC and it still stands. It's been renovated a little bit, not that much. We know exactly who built this because it's written in stone. Lucius Fabricus, son of Gaius, took care and likewise approved it be built. And there in Latin are those words, right there, still in place. This is an amazing statue. This is one of Bernini's masterpieces, Blessed Ludovica Albertoni, 1674. This is the best picture I could get because it's in a big chapel and it's all blocked off. You have to kind of stick the camera through the grate. You can see her. She's contemplating her ascension of her soul to God. These putti, or little angels, are all sculptured and in that chapel around looking down at her. Beautiful, amazing sculpture. Church de Gesù. This is the mother church of the Jesuits. I think I included this one because A, the ceiling is absolutely amazing. B, somehow I managed to capture the light coming through here on just a beautiful day, and it's just like so wonderful. The ceiling is a masterpiece. It's just out of this world. You know, the painting actually will extend. It's painted such that this is a trick of the eye. This isn't really a barrel wall. It's flat. But he painted it so that it looks like it's rounded in this area. And so you can see paint continues out here, just made to look like it's a big, huge barrel wall. It's not. This is the mother church of the Jesuit order. St. Ignatius is buried here. Part of Francis Xavier's arm is here. As you know, in the Catholic Church, and even in the Catholic Church especially, you'll see actual saints buried under the altar. They'll be there, like they're not just their bones, their whole body. Sometimes they'll have like a wax mask. Sometimes they won't. It'll just be an old kind of dried up cadaver. But you see that a lot in Rome. I didn't actually get a picture of that, but that's something you'll see. In this case, St. Ignatius was buried in a big, huge urn. Good Friday. So, as I mentioned, I was in Rome for Holy Week. So on Good Friday, after our Good Friday service there at the monastery, we headed out to the Colosseum for the Stations of the Cross, which were held outside the Colosseum. Now, the Colosseum itself is actually a church. As a church, it's known as Santa Maria della Pietà because tradition was that there were many martyrs that died here, including Ignatius of Antioch in 107 AD, being fed to the lions. Modern scholarship tends to think that actually most of the Christians that were martyred, though, were actually martyred in that huge Circus Maximus stadium that we saw earlier. So this was a picture of everybody gathering for the celebration of the Stations of the Cross, which I know you guys were doing here at the same time on Friday, because Dad told me. if you look, the little white guy right here, that's Pope Francis. So that's the best picture I could get of it. But he was up top leading the celebration. It was very interesting. Instead of it being led, the Pope was the celebrant, but each station they held a cross and they walked it around in front of Colosseum. Each station, a family read a meditation. And one of the stations, the meditation was a Ukrainian mother and a Russian mother. And it got very politically hot, and so they just held a moment of silence instead of anybody saying anything. Kind of made the national news, international news. Love this fountain. It's the Fountain of the Turtles. This fountain is an older from an earlier part of the Renaissance, but Bernini added the little turtles on top, which are really cute. And while I was there, hey man, I got the best gelato I ever ate. Ever. I texted Dad as soon as I ate it. It was so good. What is gelato? It's an Italian sort of ice cream. It uses milk, but more milk and less cream. And it also has no egg yolks. I had to look that up. I knew there was something to it. It's so good. This was so chocolatey. So good.
How good was it?
It was so good, I want to go back. The Tarpeian Rock. This is interesting. I had to find this place because I'd read about it, but I had to go kind of searching around to find it. Behind this rock is what's called the Capitol Hill. That's where the capital of Rome, the Temple of Jupiter was. These days there's a big, beautiful area that Michelangelo designed, and there's a big museum there. But behind that is this rock. Now you have to kind of use your imagination a little bit because there's buildings built on it. But you can see parts of the rock here. This rock was originally an 80-foot cliff off which murderers, traitors, perjurers, and slaves that stole were flung off to their death in Roman times. It was considered to be you had to do something particularly heinous, especially be a traitor, to be flung off this rock. According to legend, the Vestal Virgin Tarpeia, the Vestal Virgins kept the fire of Rome in this temple in the Forum in Rome. She was the daughter of the governor of the citadel. She let in some of the Roman enemy tribe, the Sabines. She says, well, if you'll give me these gold bracelets that you have, I'll let you in. She let them in, and they killed her. And they crushed her against some rocks, and the legend holds, and this is all legend, that she was buried there at the Tarpeian Rock. So because she was a traitor, that's where traitors were flung off. To be hurled off the rock was a fate worse than death. And there's a great Latin phrase, and I'm going to mangle it, Arx Tarpeia Capitoli Proxima, a warning that the capital lies very close to the Tarpeian Rock, meaning it's a short walk from the grace of the powerful to the shame of the traitor. In other words, a lot of times the fall from grace, right, that a politician might face. There's that joke. Elephant and obelisk. Love this. This is one of my favorite spots in Rome. This is an Egyptian obelisk that they decided to re-erect and work. So Bernini built this, sculpted this amazing elephant, which I just love to death. It was built in 1667. I didn't catch the age on the Egyptian obelisk, but it is one of the actual Egyptian ones. You can see the hieroglyphs in the shaft of it. Pantheon. Didn't go to the Pantheon this time. What is the Pantheon? It is the best preserved Roman temple. Why? It was built in 126 AD. You can still see, it says Marcus Agrippa basically built this, and Latin is still on the facade of it. He built an earlier one that burned down, but this is still very old, 126 AD. Pantheon was a temple to celebrate all the Roman gods. Why is it still in great shape and a great place? Because it was turned into a church really quickly after it was a temple. So because it became a church really soon, it's still a church. It's in great shape. Another Roman obelisk in front. If you've never been to the Pantheon, it's very interesting because it's the largest dome in the world for centuries. In the middle of it is an actual opening, like an opening, and rain can come through there, it just drains. But it's a beautiful, beautiful spot. This is the Fountain of Four Rivers by Bernini. It represents the four continents. What's wrong with that statement? The four continents. Well, the reason is because in 1651, that's all they knew, four continents. They counted North America and South America as one, Asia, Europe, and Africa. They didn't know about Antarctica, and they didn't know about Australia. So each one of these represents a major river. This is a very famous statue in Rome, and it's very, very beautiful. Hey, one of the great things I experienced in Rome was tiramisu, which you probably have had at Olive Garden, right? It comes in a little square, and it tastes really good. Well, in this case, the tiramisu, and every time I've had it in Rome, has always been in a little jar like this, with a little biscotti cookie on the right. This is Assisi from the train. Let me segue. That was the end of our Roman discussion. Assisi was the next place I went. When we think of Assisi, of course, we think of St. Francis of Assisi, the famous saint, both in the Catholic Church and Episcopalian Church. And this is the view I had of the city, the little town coming in on the train. It's a prototypical Italian village set up on a hill so they could defend it. Take another drink. This is the Basilica of St. Francis. This is where St. Francis actually was buried at. It's a very large basilica. The picture doesn't do justice to the size. It has an upper church and a lower church. It was St. Francis, he lived from 1181 to 1226. In a time of great, the church was in dark straits, tough times. The church had become a place where a lot of power and money was concentrated in monasteries out in the country. The people in general might not see a priest very often. St. Francis brought a revolution because he got the priests out amongst the people. Both St. Francis with the Franciscans, St. Dominic with the Dominicans. They took vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. So we'll see a little bit more here in a second. This is the lower church, absolutely beautiful, covered in frescoes. The altar you see here was donated by one of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine emperors, in about the 1100s, donated this beautiful, beautiful altar. This is the lower church ceiling. The upper church of San Francesco is covered with frescoes. A fresco is a type of painting where it's used egg and it's thrown up quickly because it dries quickly, but it can be very bright colors. Back then it was hard to make bright colors, so they would mix these colors using different egg and mix in with different types of rocks and dyes in order to make these colors. Giotto was the man who painted these, and Giotto's 1310, so we're still over 100 years before the Renaissance. He's considered to be one of the first Renaissance, proto-Renaissance painters because he painted people like they were. You can actually see the people. Before, paintings kind of look like an icon. They look stiff and flat. It is absolutely beautiful. This is St. Francis preaching to the birds. You know, we always kind of see St. Francis with the bird bath. But he was so much more than that. He was a man who, like I said, revolutionized the church. This is part of that fresco series. You see St. Francis here appealing to the Pope to recognize his new order. This is the actual tomb of St. Francis in the church. Right here you can see San Francesco area. It's deep in the inside the church, below in a crypt area there. They hid his bones for many years because they didn't want anybody to try to find them or use them for other purposes or move them. And they found them several hundred years later and moved them to this tomb. Inside the city of Assisi, there's a town square, and this is the Roman temple of Minerva. It was built in the 1st century BC. It may also be dedicated to Hercules. In the Middle Ages, it was used as a jail. And then later on, because it's converted into a church, it was just an okay church. It's not that big. But these are amazing Roman columns, amazing temple. You can still see from all those years ago back in the 1st century BC. Beautiful, Dwayne just didn't put a title up for. This is a beautiful fountain there in Assisi, and I really like it. So it's a description. This is the new church of Assisi, of course, sold in the United States from 1615. This is built over what was the boyhood home of St. Francis. And I can't remember, Dad asked, he said, is that the entrance or is that? I'm not sure, but one of those doors was the entrance to St. Francis' boyhood home. His dad was a cloth merchant, and he was wealthy. He'd done well in life. He was a cloth merchant, and he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. But St. Francis didn't want to do that. He'd read a lot of romantic stories, and he decided he wanted to become a soldier. So off he went to be a soldier. He was in a battle. He got captured. He was a prisoner. He had time to think about things. Came back, decided he met a leper on a road one day, had kind of a overwhelming sense that he needed to change his life, and that's what led him to take up the life that he led of poverty and to found the Franciscan order. This is the town square of Assisi. There's that great fountain again. I had dinner over there in those blue chairs one night. Just a beautiful place. This is, I really love this picture. This is looking out on the Umbrian plains. Umbria is the state that Assisi's in. It's the state of Umbria. And it's just absolutely beautiful. This is the Monte Frumentario and the Fonte Olivera. The Frumentario is this area on the right. The Fonte Olivera, 1570, a plaque above the fountain warns a penalty of 1 scudo and the loss of laundry for anyone who washes their clothes in this fountain. That's what that little sign says there. This is another beautiful picture of the Umbrian countryside. You can see some olive gardens there, some olive trees in the middle, and vineyards out. And this was something I just took kind of at the top of the hill there. Just a beautiful place. This was a Roman amphitheater. You can see the traces of it. There were houses built around it, but this is part of the wall of the Roman amphitheater. So that big amphitheater, like the Colosseum, was kind of copied in small copies all across the empire. This is the Basilica of St. Clare. St. Clare was St. Francis' great cooperator, who founded the Order of Nuns, the Poor Clares. She is buried here. These are flying buttresses to hold the weight, the immense weight of this cathedral. This was built back in Gothic times. I love this painting. It was in the center of Assisi in the municipal, in that city square. In the municipal area had you could walk up into one of the municipal buildings that are old. And this beautiful painting is there called the Offertory. You see St. Francis on the right, and you see Mary and the baby. And this is a new painting, 2013, but I thought it was really beautiful. Okay. Y'all hanging in there with me?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. We're going to talk very briefly about Milan. I went to Milan. I went to 2 other places. After I left, I went to Rome, I went to Assisi, I went to a place called Brescia, which I didn't include on here, and another place called Bergamo. Brescia is a pretty big town, about 500,000 people, and then I went on a day trip to Bergamo. Lastly, last part of my trip, I went to Milan for 5 days. I don't have very many slides, but I thought I'd tack these on at the end because they're pretty interesting. Here's the original Galleria. Some of y'all may have been to the Galleria up in Houston. Well, this was the original Galleria, and this thing is over the top. So you have all the major brands here. You got Dior and Prada. And I saw a T-shirt, like a T-shirt looked just like this. It was $500. I thought they lost their mind. But it was a really neat place to be in. There's lots of restaurants and places you can eat down below. Just absolutely stunning. This was built in the 19th century. The Duomo. This is the showstopper. This is Milan's cathedral. A cathedral in Italy, in many parts of Italy, is called the Duomo. And look at it. I mean, it's amazing. It was built over the centuries. It is the 3rd largest church in the world. The stained glass in this place is over the top. And there was no way I tried to just capture it as the best I could. And I was thinking about the stained glass in the church here I grew up at. It's just tremendous, just absolutely gorgeous. And it's all over the church. This is just the inside of the church. You can see the immense pillars carved. It was hard to really capture the immensity of this place, but I did my best. One of the places I went to in Milan was the Ambrosian Library. It was named after St. Ambrose, but it was not founded by him. It was founded by a cardinal in the Renaissance era. And this is the original library of the Ambrose Library, and you can see it's one of those old style libraries with the very wooden bookcases. What's interesting is, and what you'll see in a minute, these lit areas are all pieces of Leonardo da Vinci's folios with drawings of his, which you'll see in just a minute. Leonardo's da Vinci's portrait of a musician painting is there. There are not very many Leonardo da Vinci paintings. There are only 18 that are actually recognized to be for sure, well, there's 10 that are recognized to be, 8 that are recognized absolutely to be of him that he did, 10 more that it's pretty sure that he worked on. This is one of the 18, the portrait of the musician. To give you an idea, there's only one Leonardo da Vinci painting in the whole Western Hemisphere, and that's Ginevra da Vinci, which is in the United States Gallery of Art in the Smithsonian. So there's just not very many of them. I've seen now 2/3 of them. So this was Leonardo's painting. It's really hard to see, but right here, it's so detailed. Here are the musical notes that the musician's holding right here. Art historians have even tried to work out exactly, there's some writing on there too as to what he was getting at. Here are some of the, I had to supersize it, but here are some of the actual drawings from Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbooks that you see. There's one of some sort of machine. Here's another whole sketchbook. It's really interesting. If you look, Da Vinci is such a genius. This Latin that he's writing in is backwards. He wrote backwards for himself. Partly, I guess, it's a trick, and partly because I guess he didn't want people to maybe read quickly what he was writing. Partly because there were trade secrets. He sold himself not as an artist. He painted. He told one duke that he went to work for. Mostly, he went to work to build battlements and to build fortifications and siege engines. But he said in a letter, I also do a little painting. This is a famous picture, St. Mark preaching in Alexandria. This is in the Brera Museum. It was painted by the Bellini brothers. One brother painted most of it, the other one finished it. If you've ever been to Venice, this is supposed to be Alexandria, Egypt, but this is looks very much like the main church in Venice, St. Mark's, in St. Mark's Square. Really tremendous picture. You see all different types of folks gathered, from Islamic turbans to the Italian gentleman. Montaigne's Lamentation of Christ, this is his masterpiece. It's very, in art history, it's a big deal because it was one of the first pictures to be foreshortened, where the perspective is different. It was done in 1480. Another Caravaggio painting, The Supper at Emmaus. This is where Jesus is walking on the road with some disciples, and they don't realize who he is until the moment where he breaks the bread, and then they realize it's Jesus. In this case, here are the two disciples. We don't see the one here. We don't wonder what he's thinking. The other one having that moment of realization that this is Jesus. And then the two servants who have no idea what's going on. Very powerful painting. My favorite painter, Tintoretto. Italians use these little names. Tintoretto means son of a little die maker, because his father was a die maker. That's the finding, the body of St. Mark. It was also in this museum. I ripped this one off the internet because I couldn't take a good picture of it. Beautiful painting. Tintoretto is, you always know him because his halos, they don't look like regular halos. They look like a little bit of light around the head. But he's probably my favorite painter these days. And I'm going to end off with The Kiss by Hayez, one of the most famous paintings, is his most famous painting, and I think a lot of people have seen this painting. It was painted in the 1800s, and it ended my trip. It was one of the last paintings I took, my pictures I took, and that's the end of my presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
How'd you get so many pictures without people in it?
It's a good question. I think because of the pandemic, Eleanor, I think. Because
Now you got pictures
without the people, like people crowds,
Yeah.
It really, I lucked out, pandemic. In Italy, we were still wearing masks. Got to wear a mask the whole time in every venue. Of course, the week after I left, they took that requirement off. And you still have to be tested to come back to the U.S., so a lot of U.S. tourists aren't going there yet. So that's why there really just weren't that many tourists. Any other questions?
How many of these churches, or all the churches you went to, they all still have services?
Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. Even the Colosseum, there's a parish church associated with the Colosseum that still has services. They all do. There is a lot of priests in Rome. It is not uncommon to just walk down the street and there's, a Dominican in his robes, or because there's so much study that goes on in Rome and because of the Vatican itself. I ran into 3 American priests that were in their garb of their order. I think a Norbertine priest, and I was a little bit desperate to talk to somebody in English. And I heard them talking English. And, hey, Father, where are you from? And we got to talking, and I told him where I was staying. He says, "Oh, I said Mass there many times." So there's kind of a core of guys that can go out and say Mass at different churches. So they do hold every day, the Roman Catholic Church, every day there's a Mass all over the world. Any other questions, friends? No?
I got one more.
Yes, sir.
Susan and I have been to some churches in Germany, and those big churches, you go in them, and it's very dim, so if you didn't have a flash, you wouldn't see something. Was that the same there?
It was the same to a great extent, and that's why I had to rip off some of the pictures from the internet, because if they didn't have the lighting, some of the churches, especially if the chapel had a really famous painting, like some Caravaggio paintings are actually in the chapel. I couldn't get a good picture of them. But you will put €1 in a box and it will light up the chapel. And so it's a way for the church to get money and keep preservation of pictures, and it's a way to light up the chapel to get a good picture. These cameras are amazing these days. They capture so much light. But yeah, that's sometimes a problem. All right, friends. Well, that concludes my presentation. Thank y'all for coming. I appreciate everybody that came, and hope y'all enjoyed it. And if you ever want me to do another one, maybe this fall, I'll do one on the Vatican or in St. Peter's, and we can do that sometime. All right, yes, sir. All right,